So, as was just announced last week, the PFL will be officially merging with Jake Paul's Most Valuable Promotions, with the two brands scheduled to be consolidated under the MVP banner on January 1st of 2027. The new MVP MMA will be led by Jake Paul and his right-hand man, Nicky Sabedarian, with the current CEO of the PFL, John Martin, serving as the CEO of the newly merged MMA promotion. And upon the merger being officially announced, Jake Paul published a video stating that the intent of this new organization was to compete directly with the UFC and put fighters first. And in response to this news, Dana White said,
Let's take two organizations that don't sell tickets and nobody watches, and let's merge them together and make a bigger company that we won't sell tickets to and that nobody will watch.
Which is almost word for word the exact same thing that Dana White said back in 2023 when the PFL acquired Bellator MMA. And while many MMA fans are on the same page as Dana White, being dismissive of the merger, I believe that it is already safe to say that this merger is radically different from the one that took place in 2023. And that is because what Dana White said, at least about MVP MMA, is provably false. The inaugural MVP MMA card, headlined by Ronda Rousey and Gina Carano on Netflix, had a reported peak viewership of 17 million worldwide and 11.6 million in the United States, and had an average viewership of 12.4 million worldwide. That kind of viewership is unheard of for a non-UFC MMA event, and shows that MVP already has the potential to be a competitor to the UFC. However, just how big of a threat is it? Will MVP MMA just become another Bellator, a B-league for fighters that the UFC chose not to sign, and fighters past their prime who are looking for a big payday while fighting lower-level competition? Or will Jake Paul, Nicky Sabedarian, and John Martin do the unthinkable and genuinely challenge the UFC stranglehold on mixed martial arts? Well, in this video, we will be examining that possibility and how likely it is. To break down MVP MMA's chances of challenging or even dethroning the UFC's position as the industry leader, we will first examine why the UFC effectively has a monopoly over mixed martial arts, followed by breaking down the structural advantages that the newly merged MVP MMA will have over the UFC, especially when it comes to distribution and cross-promotion, as well as the weaknesses in the UFC's current promotional direction. And then, finally, I will be proposing a few ideas that I personally think that MVP MMA should consider in order to outmaneuver the UFC, which may maximize their chances of eventually winning the fight against Dana White and TKO Group Holdings. So without further ado, let's get started. First, let's cover the basics around the UFC's business model. Throughout its 30-year history as a fight promotion, the UFC has built itself up into the biggest and highest level MMA promotion in the world, to the point where the UFC is synonymous with the sport itself. There's a reason why when you tell normies that you train mixed martial arts or jiu-jitsu, they reply by saying, "Oh, so you train UFC? That's cool, I guess." In particular, by absorbing rival promotions like Pride, Strikeforce, and the WEC in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the UFC acquired almost all of the top talent outside of the promotion and gathered it under one company. This led to the UFC's belts becoming the de facto world championships of mixed martial arts, which in turn made it so that fans of the sport had no choice but to watch the UFC to watch the best fight the best. This increased viewership, compounded by the popularity of stars like Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey, has brought the UFC to the point where it's basically impossible to think of the sport of MMA existing without it. The UFC is so far ahead of its competition that it is estimated to generate 90% of the revenue from professional MMA bouts, with that remaining 10% split between every other promotion in the world. The revenue that the UFC generates means that it can theoretically outbid any rival promotion for talent, and since most prospects aren't big enough names to get a better offer from anywhere than the UFC, they end up trying to make it there no matter what. This then leads to the UFC being the dominant hirer, or buyer, of elite MMA talent, making the UFC a monopsony. And this then creates an unbreakable cycle for the UFC that makes its control of the sport completely ironclad. The UFC has the de facto world titles in MMA, leading to them having the most revenue in the sport. Having the most revenue means they can hire the best talent. Since they can hire the best talent, their titles are the de facto world titles. An example of the UFC recently flexing their monopsony power was their signing of the former KSW double champion Saladin Parnasse, a fighter who was long considered to be one of the best outside of the UFC, which then led to him being booked in a main event in Paris against Dan Hooker. And this happened immediately after Saladin competed on the inaugural MVP MMA card, right after Saladin got exposure to the North American audience by fighting on Netflix. And while this is just my guess, I believe there's a strong possibility that the UFC had heard rumblings about a merger between the PFL and MVP, which led to them giving Saladin a better offer than they would have if there was no competition. And while that is great for Saladin Parnasse since he gets paid more, and great for MMA fans since we now get to see him fight the best competition possible, it also means that the UFC snatched up the best prospect MVP had before they even got him to fight anybody significant. Another likely future example of the UFC leveraging their monopsony power to poach talent is Usman Nurmagomedov, the former Bellator and current PFL lightweight champion, and Khabib Nurmagomedov's biological cousin, which also means that Khabib likely would have married him if he were a woman. In the same week that the merger between MVP and the PFL was announced, Usman Nurmagomedov defended his PFL lightweight championship, which John Martin said would eventually become MVP's belt, against Archie Colgan. Usman Nurmagomedov handed the previously undefeated Colgan his first loss via round 1 TKO. And while Usman Nurmagomedov was on the final fight of his contract, meaning that regardless of the result of this fight, he was going to be entering free agency. And well, even though Islam Makhachev, also known as Isu among the MMA fanfiction community, had previously stated that Usman Nurmagomedov would have to take a pay cut to go to the UFC, the post-fight interview that Usman had after completing the final fight on his contract says it all.
What comes next for you?
We'll see.
Just engage you.
We'll see what's going on. It was my last fight, and MVP, they always talk trash talk a little bit about Dana. He doesn't pay. Now we're gonna see how they wanna pay.
As you just heard there, Usman is going to have to get a very good offer from MVP MMA if he's going to stay. And it is also worth noting the crazy levels of booing that Jake Paul received during the interview. It is clear that the crowd clearly does not like Jake Paul. And frankly, it might not only be the fans who don't like Jake Paul.
You had a moment with Jake Paul on the cage there. What are your thoughts on Jake as a promoter and as a fighter?
Like a promoter, you talk too much, of course, but like a fighter, he's not a fighter. He's not a fighter. What are you talking about? He's a YouTuber guy, come from YouTube. He have a lot of money, but fighter live different. If you want to see fighter, come to my gym.
But he did say that a fight between you and Justin Gaethje, he thinks you would win that fight. He thinks you are the best lightweight fighter in the world right now.
You know, guys, like when somebody doesn't give the respect for Justin, this is, to be honest, this is not good. Justin Gaethje is a legend. I'm really happy to he's a champion right now, and I wish all the best to Justin. Keep doing legacy, but money, brother, is I have a family. Legacy doesn't pay check, no. We'll see. Like, I don't want to go ahead and say something like big words. Like I said, I have to talk with Khabib, and then we will make the decision.
If your own champion is telling you off for disrespecting the reigning UFC champion and a legend of the sport, that might not be a great sign. And this attitude that Jake Paul has might be something that might need to be changed, which I will be going over later on in the suggestions section of this video. And then, right after the UFC Belgrade card, when Dana White was asked about signing Usman Nurmagomedov, this was his reply.
And last one from me, Usman Nurmagomedov has finished his contract with PFL. Is that someone you'd be interested in signing and bringing to the UFC?
Sure.
Cool.
So, based upon what we've seen so far, it seems more and more likely that we will be seeing Usman in the UFC very soon. To which I have to say, dang, Khabib really is kind of screwing over John Pork, especially since John Pork is older than Usman. But setting that aside, there are a few reasons why most fighters choose to go to the UFC even if they have to take a cut in pay. First off, even if their pay gets reduced initially, if they end up winning the UFC title, which is basically what every single fighter thinks in their mind, they will end up making more than if they were to be in any other promotion. And second, being in the UFC opens up sponsorship opportunities that won't be available to those in smaller, lesser-known promotions. While the UFC doesn't allow fighters to put sponsors on their shorts, Basically, every single high-profile fighter out there is promoting some product or service, be it supplements, nicotine pouches, or gambling. I mean, nobody thinks that Khabib would have been able to pull off as many crypto scams as he did if he spent his entire career in Bellator, right? However, as we will go over next, the structural advantages that the new MVP MMA has may change all of that, and make it an equally lucrative option for fighters to pursue. So starting with the biggest advantage that MVP has over the UFC, it is absolutely and undoubtedly the fact that they are on Netflix, while the UFC is on Paramount+. Netflix is by far the bigger streaming platform, having 325 million global paid subscribers as opposed to Paramount Plus's 79.6 million. This alone makes MVP MMA's total potential reach and viewership higher than that of the UFC. And frankly, that alone makes MVP MMA a potential competitor to the UFC, as the biggest hurdle that other promotions like the PFL and Championship faced was getting a broadcasting partnership on a major platform in the first place. I mean, when it comes to Championship, they've resorted to broadcasting their fights on their own subscription service called The Inner Circle, because it is looking increasingly likely that Amazon Prime won't renew their deal when it runs out in 2027 because nobody watches them. But with MVP, and frankly, with anything involving Jake Paul, Netflix has been shown time and time again that viewers will tune in. And since viewers will be tuning in no matter what, this will make it more likely for fighters on MVP MMA cards to get high-paying sponsors, further contributing to the increase in fighter pay. Another advantage that MVP has over the UFC is that they are not yet a publicly traded company, meaning that they are not obligated to turn a profit for their shareholders. As Nikisa Bidarian told Bloomberg, MVP will be aiming to provide fighters with at least 50% of the revenue they generate, which is over double the 20% revenue split that the UFC provides to their fighters. Granted, the UFC currently generates far more revenue than MVP, but as MVP generates momentum by putting on more shows, we will inevitably see that number increase. And furthermore, MVP is still operating on investor money from 885 Capital and Knighthead Capital Management, with those investors providing PFL with $50.4 million to help facilitate the merger. The UFC, which is publicly traded as a part of TKO Group Holdings, is already operating to maximize returns for shareholders, while MVP will be operating to obtain, or rather steal, market share away from the UFC. And this leads me to the weaknesses in the UFC's current business practices, which I believe MVP can possibly exploit. Currently, the UFC has a media rights deal with Paramount Plus, where Paramount Plus pays the UFC a guaranteed $7.7 billion over the course of 7 years, meaning that the UFC gets $1.1 billion in broadcasting revenue from Paramount per year, no matter what they put on their cards, as long as they fulfill their contractual obligations of holding 13 numbered events and 30 fight nights. This means that, theoretically speaking, the UFC could do all of their shows in the Apex for the next 7 years and still receive that broadcasting revenue. Unless, of course, there's a provision in the deal that makes it so that the UFC has to do shows in front of crowds. Getting guaranteed broadcasting revenue means that the UFC is incentivized to minimize their costs for putting on cards, which means that they are incentivized to minimize production costs and book lower-cost fighters for the majority of their events. And we have no better example of that than the fight night headlined by Mateusz Gamrot vs. Colin Salkild that is taking place around the time that I'm releasing this video. As everybody is pointing out, this is an abysmally understacked fight night, featuring only 2 ranked male fighters, who are the guys in the main event, and then the rest of the card is filled out by fighters coming straight off the Contender Series who are all probably on contracts that are $12K to show and $12K to win. And since this fight night is in the Apex, the production costs are minimized as well. And then we come to the other big issue that comes with the UFC getting guaranteed broadcasting revenue, which is their increasing pursuit of site fees. Since the UFC doesn't need to put on events that appeal to a global audience because they're guaranteed money no matter what the UFC has shifted to doing is putting on arena shows in countries that are willing to pay the UFC to come there. Recent examples of this are the UFC events that took place in Abu Dhabi, Belgrade, and Baku. For example, with UFC Belgrade, the Serbian government paid the UFC 260 million dinars, or a little over 2.2 million euros, just to put on a fight night in the city. And it's not like the various governments get a cut of the ticketing revenue for these events either. The UFC pockets that as well. Now, while this may look fine at first glance, there is a chance that the UFC's pursuit of site fees may cost them in the long run. If you recall the UFC Baku and UFC Abu Dhabi fight nights, you would know that there were many fights on those cards that were not so great. Fighters like Tahir Abdullayev, Farman Hassanov, and Abubakar Vagaev put on performances that were all incredibly boring. And all of those guys were signed to the UFC precisely because they are from that region of the world. These guys aren't the best of the best. They're only being given fights in the UFC because they have regional support. The UAE, Serbia, and Azerbaijan don't have many elite fighters hailing from their countries, but they can still pay the UFC to basically give their guys fights. And that is why we had Uros Medic versus Daniel Rodriguez main eventing in front of a crowded arena, while the rematch between Manel Kape and Koji Horiguchi took place in a warehouse instead of at the Saitama Super Arena like their first fight. It's because the Japanese government isn't going to be handing away the taxes of its citizens to Dana White and Ari Emanuel. And I believe that the performances that guys who are brought in to cater to their respective regions, like Hassanov, Abdullayev, and Vagaev put on, will lead to the UFC's overall quality as an entertainment product becoming worse. And this is something that MVP can capitalize on by focusing on prioritizing the global MMA audience over catering to specific regions like the UFC does. And then, there's the final structural advantage that MVP has over the UFC, which is that they are open to cross-promotion. And if you're familiar with my channel, you know what I'm about to bring up. On September 10th, or September 11th in Japan time, Rizin will be putting on Super Rizin 5, a massive MMA card at the Kyocera Dome in Osaka, which has a max capacity of 50,000 people. And the headliner for this event will be the undefeated Rizin featherweight champion, Rajabali Shadalaev, fighting the number 2 ranked PFL featherweight contender, AJ McKee, in the first ever cross-promotional title fight. This fight will not only be for the Rizin featherweight championship, but also for the vacant PFL featherweight championship. And as John Martin said, the PFL championships will become MVP MMA's titles once the brands are merged in 2027. This means that Shadalaev versus McKee is basically a fight to determine the first ever MVP featherweight champion, which is why you should totally watch it, by the way, if you plan on following MVP MMA in the future. However, the cross-promotion between Rizin and PFL, soon to be MVP, almost certainly isn't going to be limited to a single event. Back when Bellator was still around, Rizin did multiple cross-promotional events with them, including a full-on Bellator vs. Rizin card on New Year's Eve of December 2022. It is completely within reason that we may see MVP MMA vs. Rizin on New Year's Eve of this year, especially since the brands are meant to be consolidated on January 1st of 2027. Like, what would be a better way to finalize the merger of PFL and MVP MMA than by putting it on a card that takes place on New Year's? New Year's Eve MMA cards have not only been a historically significant part of MMA since the days of Pride and K1 Heroes, but even more importantly, the UFC doesn't put on events from mid-December until early January. That means that there is no way that the UFC can counter-program an event like that, which gives MVP an opportunity to run a powerful marketing campaign to help establish itself as a brand. Just imagine if you had Francis Ngannou fighting Rico Verhoeven or Vadim Nemkov in Japan on New Year's Eve. You might as well call that Pride Fighting Championships at this point. But anyways, now that we're done covering some of the UFC's shortcomings and MVP MMA strengths as a promotion, let's move on to what I believe they can do to build momentum as an organization and avoid some of the pitfalls that could make fans dislike them. So, starting off with the elephant in the room, let's talk about Jake Paul. As everybody knows, not many people like Jake Paul, and for very understandable reasons. Jake Paul made his name in the combat sports world by beating up past their prime fighters like Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, Anderson Silva, Nate Diaz, and Mike Tyson. And while all of those fighters did get a big payday, it just isn't a good look for the guy who is the face of your promotion that is supposedly putting fighters first, being known for what amounts to legally sanctioned elder abuse. Furthermore, Jake has not only gone on to disrespect fighters like Justin Gaethje, but has also said this about the wrestling abilities of MMA fighters.
And then wanting to do MMA, I have a wrestling background, Division I. When I see these MMA fighters wrestling, I'm actually embarrassed for them. They wouldn't last a minute in Ohio Division I high school wrestling.
Yeah.
So excited to go into MMA and showcase my skills there next year.
Now, Jake Paul is very good at getting public attention, and everybody wants to see Jake lose in brutal fashion. However, having a bona fide heel as the face of MVP might not be good in the long run, as you're just going to have everybody rooting for the promotion to fail to spite Jake Paul. Furthermore, trying to downplay the skills of UFC fighters just comes across as cope. So instead, I would recommend that Jake Paul and Nikita Bidarian take a page out of the approach that Scott Coker and Nobuyuki Sakakibara take, which is to basically say, the UFC has fantastic fighters, but who knows? Maybe we have the best fighters in the world instead. If MVP is going to become a serious threat to the UFC, there needs to be a plausible argument for their fighters being the best in the world. It doesn't have to be 100% confirmed, of course. It just has to be a plausible argument. And when it comes to two fighters that will likely fight for MVP, you can definitely make an argument for them being the best in the world. And those two are Francis Ngannou and Muhammad Mokaev. As everybody who follows the sport already knows, Francis Ngannou is the lineal heavyweight champion of the world, having vacated his UFC title without losing. And in his final UFC fight, Ngannou defeated Cyril Gane, who just won the interim UFC heavyweight title by KOing Alex Pereira. And if Cyril Gane beats Tom Aspinall in their eventual rematch, then I think that we would all unanimously have to agree that MVP has the best heavyweight on the planet, and it would be silly to deny that being the case. And when it comes to Mokaev, he was released from the UFC without having lost a single time, and ended up racking up a few good wins during his stint in the promotion. He has a win over Charles Johnson, a guy who has a win over the current UFC champion, Joshua, and he also technically has a win over Manel Kape, who has been on an absolute tear recently by KOing the likes of Kyoji Horiguchi and Brandon Royval. And depending upon who wins between Pantoja and Van in their rematch, we could very well see Manel Kape win the UFC title by the end of the year. And now, while the argument for being the best flyweight in the world is much weaker in Mokaev's case, the fact that he's undefeated throughout his professional career helps to create that plausible narrative. A third possible candidate for plausibly being the best in the world would be the winner of Rajabali Shade Alive versus AJ McKee, and especially so if it is Rajabali. Rajabali Shade Alive is not only undefeated, but has finished every single one of his opponents within the first 2 rounds. So, if I'm MVP, I would be putting a lot of promotional effort into the flyweight, featherweight, and heavyweight divisions. And in addition to that, we will also likely see Jake Paul make his MMA debut under the MVP banner. And while that isn't going to be a high-level bout by any means, it's going to draw a lot of eyeballs to whatever card he's on, which in turn could be used to promote everybody else on that card. And now, as we near the end of this video, I would like to propose a sort of crazy idea that might be right up Jake Paul and Nikita Bidarian's alley. As Jake Paul likes to shove in our faces all of the time, MVP has put a lot of effort into promoting women's boxing. And while women's boxing still only has a tiny fraction of the popularity that its male counterpart has, the success that MVP has had in promoting it has exceeded basically every other previous promoter that I can think of. And that is why I think a way that MVP could outmaneuver the UFC in terms of fight promotion is to put on shows featuring weight classes that the UFC does not have. And here, I'm thinking of men's strawweight and women's atomweight. Currently, the biggest promotion for men's strawweight is One Championship, and the biggest promotion for women's atomweight is either Ryzen or One. And there are plenty of regional leagues that have bouts that are contested at those weight classes. It's just that when they want to make it to a major promotion, they have to either choose One Championship, where they're going to be stuck in contract hell, or fight up a weight class. If MVP MMA wants to put fighters first and create an argument for the fighters they have being the best in the world at a given weight class, they absolutely should establish those weight divisions. And yeah, sure, men's strawweight and women's atomweight might not be popular at first, but the same was said for men's flyweight in the UFC, where it was incredibly unpopular back in the days of Demetrius Johnson's title reign. But now, it is probably the most beloved division among hardcore MMA fans. So yeah, since MVP MMA doesn't have to turn a profit yet, it's definitely worth trying at least, right? But anyways, let's now move on to the conclusion of this video, where I gave my honest opinion on whether MVP MMA is a threat to the UFC or not. Now, to answer the question posed in the title, do I think that MVP MMA is a threat to the UFC? And well, that answer is a tepid yes. I do think that is the case. And while you may be dismissive of that, I believe that is borne out by the UFC's own actions. The fact that the UFC not only signed Saladin Parnasse, but immediately threw him into a main event against Dan Hooker shows that they don't want high-level free agents on the market. The same applies to Dana White's enthusiasm towards signing Usman Nurmagomedov, albeit that might just be because he likes the idea of having another Dagestani associated with Khabib as lightweight champion. We have yet to see how this merger between PFL and MVP turns out, but if MVP plays their cards correctly and genuinely puts fighters first while getting Jake Paul brutally KO'd on Netflix to get people to hate watch, I think there is some real potential here. MVP already have fighters who you can make a genuine argument for being the best in the world, and there are plenty of prospects on the come-up that the UFC might end up missing out on. And of course, if MVP versus Ryzen ends up happening this New Year's Eve or next, I will absolutely go there because you know that the production is going to be amazing, and I just love the idea of Jake Paul getting soccer kicked. Seriously, if Jake Paul gets flatline KO'd by a soccer kick or stomp, I think that alone may change the MMA landscape. But anyways, thanks for watching or listening until the end. I hope you finished cleaning your room or washing your dishes, and if you're hearing this, I want to give you kudos for having a fantastic attention span. Goodbye.